Unjustified, unreasonable, unconstitutional. A federal judge has ruled that the Liberal government's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act in response to the Ottawa convoy protest violated the charter. It was a lengthy ruling published today that acknowledged the protests in the nation's capital and across the country caused harm to the economy, trade, and commerce. However, they did not rise to the level of a threat to national security as defined by the law. If you haven't guessed it already, Trudeau's government is set to appeal the decision. Federal Court Justice Richard Mosley found the situation created by the protests in Ottawa did not meet the threshold to invoke the Emergencies Act.
This is a peaceful protest!
Rather than Prime Minister Trudeau facing the cameras today,
we do not agree with this decision, and respectfully, we will be appealing it.
Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland provided the government's response.
We believed we were doing something necessary and something legal at the time.
In early 2022, thousands of angry protesters descended on Ottawa to make their frustrations known about the pandemic response and vaccine requirements. They blocked border points in Windsor and in Alberta, and protesters in the nation's capital parked trucks and large vehicles within key arteries of the city for nearly a month, honking their horns for days on end. Then on February 14, 2022, for the first time in Canada's history, Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act to allow the federal government to use powers like giving police additional avenues to arrest protesters, go after financial support tied to the protest, and one of the most controversial, the freezing of participants' bank accounts.
The police will be given more tools to restore order in places where public assemblies can constitute illegal and dangerous activities.
We were convinced at the time, I was convinced at the time, it was the right thing to do.
But that wasn't good enough for the federal judge who wrote, quote, "I have concluded that the decision to issue the proclamation does not bear the hallmarks of reasonableness, justification, transparency, and intelligibility, and was not justified in relation to the relevant factual and legal constraints that were required to be taken into consideration."
Our national security was under real threat, our national security, including our economic security. That was the reality of that moment. We explored many, many avenues to bring this to an end. This was an option of the last resort. We believed at the time.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre reacting to the news on X today. He's putting the blame on the Prime Minister, saying he caused the crisis by dividing people. Then he violated charter rights to illegally suppress citizens. As PM, I will unite our country for freedom.
The reason we were in that crisis was a direct failure of Justin Trudeau's leadership and also other levels of government that failed to act, to take the challenge presented seriously. Their inaction resulted in a serious crisis where we reluctantly supported the invocation of the emergencies measures. We said that that was something that we reluctantly supported.
The Emergencies Act defines a national emergency as a temporary, urgent, and critical situation that seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians, and is of such proportions or nature as to exceed the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it.
As our Minister of Justice has said, we will, confident in that belief, be appealing this decision. Thank you very much. Thank you.
The decision by the federal government to appeal today's ruling sets up a legal battle that could go all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. While there's no cost ramification for the government, the political impact could be staggering. The case was brought forward in part by the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and I'm joined tonight by the Executive Director, Noa Mendelsohn Aviv. Noa, this is a huge victory for the CCLA. What message does this send to the Canadian people tonight?
It's a huge victory for the Canadian people who care about rights and freedoms, because without checks and balances on the power of government, any one of those rights or freedoms can be taken away. And that was what concerned us. And that's why we said the government cannot invoke emergency powers unless there is truly a national emergency. And this victory for Canada, for democracy, said what happened in Ottawa, as difficult as it was, as much as it needed to be addressed, that was not a national emergency. It did not justify using emergency powers.
It was found that the Liberals exceeded their powers, but for the average Canadian who looked at the chaos in Ottawa at the time, police didn't seem to be doing much for weeks on end. The province wasn't anywhere to be found to handle the situation. So what other options were there for the federal government?
I mean, ultimately, the blockades and the disruption in Ottawa, including, impacts on marginalized and vulnerable communities, which had to be addressed, all of that was handled through policing. Ultimately, it took will, and it took will to get it done, and that's what they did. The detail of how the protest was dismantled, how the disruption was ended, and how Ottawa was put back to rights, because there was unlawful disruptive protest, and there was legitimate protest as well, and it was all going on together. Ultimately, it was a policing issue that had to be addressed by police, and that is what took place. Emergency powers were not necessary, and that is what the federal government said today as well. And the dangers of using emergency powers is what CCLA and so many other people were concerned about.
The Liberals have been swift to say they are appealing. I'm sure you've already been discussing Chrystia Freeland's statement today. So what is next for the Civil Liberties Association?
Well, I mean, we're going to consider our next steps, but I think it's fairly safe to say that this is a very important issue for us, for CCLA, for all of Canada, for everybody who cares about their rights and freedoms. And we're going to continue to push it because it is critical that this and any future government, whoever they may be, whatever their political stripe, understands that they cannot give themselves massive powers unless it is truly necessary. There is a true threat to national security across the country that ordinary laws cannot handle, and the federal court found on evidence that was not the case.
Thank you for your time tonight, Noa, and all the best.
Thank you.